r/NoSleep. Posted by u/snoo, hobbies7109. The only way you can get to my new town is through the graveyard. Part 2. Let me say, I can't believe I've come to a point in my real life where I'm giving actual thought to whether or not I may be dead. But, let's look at the facts. I was offered a job I am not actually qualified for based on a 20-year-old resume. My new town of residence is only accessed through a graveyard, and is surrounded by 100-foot walls. And, apparently the language arts department has a dramatic fairy problem which they address with spears. Oh, and let's not forget my secretary seems to be some sort of serpent in disguise, and my assistant made me bleed while low-key threatening me. Given all of this complete nonsense that seems like it couldn't possibly be real or true, I guess it doesn't seem too crazy to think that, yeah, maybe I am dead. But, the thing is, I don't remember dying. I came home after that first day of work, admittedly, exhausted. I let myself into my new house, stepped inside, and immediately relished the quietness. It was one of those big old Victorian houses with a wrap-around front porch, huge windows, and beautiful shining floors and woodwork. But, it had also been completely updated and modernized. So it was the best of both worlds, both the old world charm, and modern comforts. As soon as I walked in, I realized I must have left music on somewhere, because I could hear some very quiet peaceful music coming from inside the house. Like the sort of music you hear in relaxation games for your phone. I didn't even recall turning on music, let alone leaving it on. Nonetheless, it had an instant calming effect on me. I made a beeline for my kitchen which was fully stocked, another gift from my new employers. There was a Keurig coffee maker. I hadn't been a fan of Keurig coffee prior to coming to Winter Clear. I'd had it once as a fellow teacher had a maker in her classroom. I tend to prefer good old-fashioned pots of coffee. However, here in Winter Clear, here in my new kitchen, the coffee was excellent. The best I had ever tasted. So, I guess that does slightly lend toward the afterlife theory, and maybe it's heaven since the coffee is perfect. I sat down at the kitchen island, sipping my coffee and clearing my mind. I started doing all the things. Pinching myself. Looking at the clock to see if it revealed the time correctly. Poking my finger into my palm, to see if it would go through my palm or touch it. Looking down at my feet to see if they were there, or if I was just hovering with no feet. All was as would be expected in reality. Then I remembered, those are all the ways to tell if you're dreaming. Not how to tell if you're dead. I can say concretely that I'm not dreaming, but I don't know how to test if I'm dead. So I guess I'm putting a pin in that. Next, I decided to go for a drive. I pulled my car out of the garage and onto the street. The neighborhood was vibrant with life late in the afternoon. Kids out playing, folks out walking their dogs. The sun hung high in the sky casting a beatific glow down on everything. I drove about the streets of town, taking in the architecture, the cute shops in the downtown, the restaurants, and the gorgeous background of the forest and the mountains in the distance. It made it so that you barely even noticed the wall. I made way to the edge of town, the same road I had brought it on. I slowly cruised out of town, onto the secluded and wooded highway. I drove slowly, eyes starting about nervously. I expected someone or something to jump out of the shadows and stop me. But nothing did, and I ended up back at the mouth of the tunnel. There was a sign next to it with vintage font that said, "Leaving so soon?" I idled there in the opening of the tunnel for a long time, staring into the dim light and the shadows. Then, I drove in. When I got back to the stone cover of the closed tunnel, I idled once more. I took the keys out of my ignition and studied the fob. Mr. Carlyle had given it to me the night he took me to my new house. There were buttons on it, and one of them, he had told me, was a control to open the tunnel. I was supposedly free to go, but something told me that if I pushed the button, nothing would happen. I didn't feel free to go earlier when he had his claws in my arm. I held out the fob with a shaking hand for a long time, and then finally, I pushed the button. The fountain overhead began to open, grinding its slow churning gears, spilling sunlight down into the tunnel. I flinched, expecting some sort of alarm to sound or lights to flash. But, nothing happened. Finally, I drove out. Back into the day. Back into the graveyard. Once outside, I stopped again, idling some more. There were people in the cemetery, tending to graves, visiting, walking. I was free to drive up to any of them and ask if they were aware that there was a nearby town where students get speared in the face. But, I didn't. No one seemed to even notice me. Instead, I decided, that since I really was free to go, that I would stay for the time being. I turned my car around, and went back into the tunnel. The fact that I could leave anytime I pleased made me feel somehow better about everything, and by the time I made it back to Winter Clear, my attitude had undergone a huge adjustment. Unfortunately, it plummeted again when I pulled onto my street and I ran into a boy who just appeared out of nowhere in front of my car. I shouted in horror as I caught just a glimpse of his face before he was dragged down beneath the wheels of my car. The car lifted and fell twice as it rolled fully over his body. I came to a stop and swiveled in my seat to see the kid in the street, groaning and writhing, and twisted into a grotesque position it didn't seem possible to survive. I began to shriek. That's what the woman tried to tell me when she pulled open my car door and started patting my shoulder and frantically trying to comfort or soothe me. What is with the shoulder patting around here? I stumbled out of my car and around it, right past the lady and to the boy in the road. He was very gray, as though he'd already lost every bit of blood, but weirdly, there wasn't any blood anywhere. He groaned and grunted, and moved very slightly and sort of twitched. A crowd had gathered, mostly keeping off to the sides, staying on the sidewalks. I saw them whispering and pointing, but I was still hysterical, so I dropped down next to the boy to do what? I don't know. Comfort him? Administer first aid? I don't know. One of his legs was bent at a right angle in the wrong direction. A bone showed clear through the torn skin of his right arm. Most horrifically, the bottom of his jaw was missing completely. I didn't even understand how that could have happened. I was a fountain of snot. This was about as much trauma as I cared to endure in one first day of school, but I didn't want to make it all about me. Finally, reality reached me, and the little comforting lady had come up behind me again. Principal Breckenridge?" she said, tapping my shoulder. "You should move back, dear. Vambies aren't friendly necessarily. Particularly when you run them over." As if on cue, I watched in utter horror as the grotesque individual lying in the street struggled and writhed himself into a sitting position, and then he stood up. The groups of people on either side of the street gave one big collective gasp very dramatically, then they all scattered and began to walk away quickly. No running, mind you. Just leaving at their own chosen speeds. I don't know why I even thought about it just then, but it seemed weird to see no one standing around filming the event. This seemed like a textbook formula for online viral stardom if you just pulled out your phone and filmed it. But no, they all just scurried away like ants. The lady linked her hands around my arm and began pulling me backwards. I stared in horror as the disgusting, bottom-jawless thing began tripping and staggering forward. But, just as the old lady had dragged me almost to the curb, the boy vanished. Just puff, gone. I was left standing there, mouth agape, with the little old lady holding my arm, and my car all whopper-jawed in the street. She patted my shoulder. I dragged my eyes away from the empty place where the boy had just been and swiveled my head to peer down at her. She smiled very sweetly. "What say you and I sit down for a cup of coffee together and chat?" For a second all I could do was blink and stare, so she continued. "I'm actually your next-door neighbor, Hypatia Gilroy. It'd be just dandy to sit down and get to know you better." She giggled and gave me the biggest smile. "Don't you think?" Finally I nodded. She gently coaxed me back into my car, to get it back out of the middle of the road. My house was just ahead, and I pulled it into my driveway. Hypatia Gilroy scampered up the walk and together, we went inside. She made herself right at home. It was like she'd been here many times, which suddenly made me wonder who had lived in this house in the past. She followed me into the kitchen and I went weakly through the motions of preparing 2 cups of coffee. When I eventually got to sip the divine stuff again, the fugue state I'd entered began to lift. "So, Ms. Gilroy." "Oh, it's Mrs. Hypatia," said cheerily. "My dear sweet Henry has been dead and gone 17 years now. But my heart is still very much married to him. At any rate, please call me Hypatia." I smiled. "Okay, Hypatia. Thank you, and I'm Alice." "So pleased to meet you, Alice. We've all been so excited to meet you, here in Winter Clear. And you seem just as lovely as Mr. Carlyle told everyone." "Thank you," I said shyly. "Well, anyway. Did you tell me that person was a vambi?" "Oh yes, I'd almost forgotten. Yes, a vambi, that's right." I waited a beat for her to go on, but of course, she didn't. Because I've learned around here that no one just offers an explanation. They act like you ought to just know everything. "Well, what is a vambi, if I may?" She chortled. "Ooh, a vambi. Well, isn't that a funny question?" she said breathlessly, hooting with laughter. Was it? Was it a funny question? I didn't get the joke. "I suppose vambi is just a nickname for them, brought about by all the popular culture nonsense. I guess terms you'd probably understand would be vampire and zombie. A cross between those two things. I grimaced. What? You mean the thing that I saw with my own eyes is a made-up creature comprising two types of things that don't exist? Is that what you're meaning to tell me, Hypatia? Hypatia pursed her lips. Clearly, Alice, those are not made-up creatures who don't exist if you saw them with your own eyes, correct? Now, you're a principal, you should be capable of common sense, I would assume. My face probably looked like one of those emoji with flat horizontal lines instead of eyes and a mouth. Vambies, Hypatia continued, actually happened by accident. I may be mistaken, and please don't quote me, but I do believe here in Winterclear is where the only vambies exist. Some vampire or other at some point was feeding on somebody, and normally, when you're a vampire, you will either just feed on the person to death, or you go too far, and you actually convert your victim into a vampire, him or herself. We do have pretty strict rules here about not converting folks to vampirism. You're with me so far, correct? I just stared at her with my mouth hanging open. Better shut that, dear, bugs will fly in, she quipped. Then she continued. But, I suppose maybe it was an inexperienced vampire who accidentally went both too far and not far enough. He fed on a victim until it was essentially dead, but not quiet. Also not quite far enough to be converted into a full vampire. Therefore we're left with these characters that do require blood as sustenance to live, like a vampire, and are fairly immortal like a vampire, but they are rather low intelligence, low vibe. Like a zombie. They don't really eat brains per se, like those zombies in the comic books, but they can be bitey if you rub them the wrong way. And even though they're hard to kill, it isn't impossible. Basically like both a vampire and a zombie. But, we don't necessarily like to kill around here. We're not barbarians. Except for bad fairies in the language arts department, I thought. So, anyway, vambies are disabled, that's how we think of it. And you take care of your disabled population, isn't that right? That's how to be a good and decent community. We make sure they have housing and jobs so that they can feel useful in the community, and in exchange, they provide food for some of our vampire population so that they don't have to go around killing or converting people. The vampires can just feed on the vambies, and the vambies never die or turn to vampires. And the vambies themselves only need just ever so little bits of blood here and there. It's really a marvelous system, if you ask me. I stared at her, blinking mindlessly for a long time. I couldn't think of a single thing to say. This stuff would all seem so crazy if I wasn't seeing these things for myself. Hypatia Gilroy was such a sweet and friendly old lady. Suddenly I thought maybe she could help me make it all make sense. How did it disappear? I whispered. She sipped her coffee and simultaneously reached forward to pat my hand. Dear, that vambi was a he. Let's use proper pronouns, very few individuals care to be called it, although, I suppose some wouldn't mind. Anyway, he disappeared because his keeper summoned him. I started to think of millions of questions. Suddenly, my words were stumbling over one another to get out of my mouth. Hypatia, listen, I'm wondering. Am I dead? Because you've got to give me this place is freaking weird. Scary as all get out, but also weirdly charming? If I am dead, I can't tell. Am I in heaven or hell? Hypatia cracked up laughing. It took her a second to compose herself. Dead? What on earth would make you think that? She took a dainty little cloth out of the sleeve of her blouse and dabbed her eyes beneath her wire-rimmed glasses with it. I've just been talking to some friends, and there is a big consensus that I might be dead, I exclaimed. She suddenly stopped laughing. Friends? What friends have you been talking to? Do dead people talk to friends? Talk sense, girl. I blushed and looked down at the table. Well, I guess it's not how you would traditionally think of talking to friends. I posted about it on Reddit. Hypatia groaned. Reddit? Merciful heavens, those people aren't your friends. She began to laugh again. Aw, come on, I said, a little surprised to find that this little old lady even knew what Reddit was. There are tons of cool people on Reddit. She abruptly stopped laughing again. All of a sudden it seemed like all the sound just dropped out of the world and all the prior kindness was gone from her now cold face. Not everyone on the whole wide internet needs to know our business, Alice. What subreddit did you post this on? She demanded darkly. NoSleep, I whispered, feeling like a young child who had no choice but to admit her wrongdoing. Hypatia began to shriek with laughter once again. This time she struck me as slightly unhinged while she laughed hysterically and dabbed her eyes. Oh, NoSleep? That's fine then, nobody will believe you there. After she settled down, I finally went on. One person had some ideas that kind of resonated with me for some reason. They mentioned iron, silver, and salt. Having things to protect myself. And then this other person pointed out that there might be rules here that I should follow, and that I needed to find out, and whatever I did, I need to follow them. Hypatia stared at me for a moment as though she was trying to gather her thoughts. She took a breath like she was about to answer, but then she turned into stone. She sat there perched on my bar stool, a rock-hard mass of stone. Then, with a rather alarming loud sound, she cracked and shattered into a million broken pieces and tumbled to the floor.